moment the cars rolled out for practice in Abu Dhabi, something became clear almost instantly. This weekend is not going to play out the way most fans expect. The title is on the line, the pressure is at its peak, and yet the very first long-run data from FP2 started raising questions that no headline timesheet could answer. Because buried behind the usual purple sectors and timing graphics were quiet signals. Signals that hinted Max Verstappen might be hiding more than he's showing, that McLaren's pace isn't as simple as they look quick, and that the fight between Lando, Norris and Oscar Piastri is nowhere near as balanced as it appeared a month ago. And by the time you connect those dots, the entire outlook of this championship decider suddenly looks very different. That's what this video is about, understanding what the numbers actually mean, not what the leaderboard says. So let's start with the part everyone always jumps to first, the FP2 long runs. FP1 took place in scorching heat, far hotter than anything we'll see on race day, which makes FP1 almost useless for predicting race pace. FP2 though, FP2 is the closest match to the conditions that matter. And when you break down those longer stints, the first big surprise is that Lando Norris shows the strongest baseline race pace. His average laps come in around the low 1 minute 33 seconds, steady, clean and consistent. Verstappen's average looks a bit slower, but that number is misleading. His stint includes a few slower outliers that pull the average down. And when you remove those, you find a group of laps that sit almost exactly on top of Norris's. That means we're not looking at a simple McLaren is faster scenario. We're looking at two drivers whose pace overlaps in key moments, with details that matter far more than the timing screen suggests. The next thing that jumps out is how these stints evolve over time. At the start of their runs, Verstappen and Norris are almost identical. Same tyre compound, similar lap counts, nearly matched pace. If you only watched the first half of Verstappen's stint, you'd probably think the fight was dead even. But as the runs stretched on, Verstappen's pace began to fade. Is that tyre drop-off? Traffic? A planned variation? Hard to tell. Verstappen simply ran more laps. And with more laps comes more noise in the data. The key is this. Verstappen's fastest, cleanest laps line up with Norris. The slower laps create the gap, not the peak performance. But the biggest difference early on isn't in the corners. It's in the straights. Verstappen is hitting top speeds around 311 kilometers per hour, one of the highest from any driver in the FP2 race runs. Norris tops out closer to 305 kilometers per hour. 6 kilometers per hour is not a small difference. That's the difference between completing a pass or getting stuck behind the DRS train. And it shows something crucial. Red Bull has trimmed the car for straight-line speed, while McLaren is leaning heavily on downforce. That trade-off will define the entire weekend. When you look deeper into those FP2 long runs, the story becomes even more interesting. At first glance, the data almost tricks you into thinking Norris is simply faster. But when you chart the laps in order, a different pattern appears. Verstappen's early laps match Norris stride for stride, almost like both drivers are running the same script. The moment Verstappen hits clean air on the medium tyre, his times fall right into the same window. But after several more laps, his numbers begin to drift upward. That drop-off isn't huge, but it's enough to widen the gap when you compare stint averages. This is why relying on a single average time often paints the wrong picture. Norris ran fewer laps. Verstappen stretched his run out. That alone creates a natural bias. If Norris had continued for the same distance, we might have seen similar fall-off, or none at all. It's the classic FP2 complication. Sometimes the missing laps are as important as the ones you can see. What becomes undeniable, though, is how differently the two cars are set up. Red Bull has gone aggressively in one direction, and McLaren has gone just as aggressively in the opposite. Verstappen's top speed advantage isn't a coincidence. A 6 km/h gain suggests a very deliberate trim. Less rear wing, less drag, more straight-line punch. It's a setup that makes perfect sense if Red Bull expects Verstappen to be fighting in traffic or defending from a McLaren in qualifying. But that benefit on the straights comes with a cost. In the corners, especially the faster ones, the McLaren holds more grip, feels more stable, and recovers lap time with ease. This tug-of-war between straight-line speed and cornering load is shaping the entire competitive picture in Abu Dhabi. And the telemetry confirms this. Whenever the track bends, and the car is asked to carry high speed through a corner, Norris gains. These aren't huge chunks of time individually, but they add up. A tenth here, half a tenth there, and suddenly the McLaren pulls ahead, even if the Red Bull claws some of it back on the next straight. This is why the top speed gap isn't enough to guarantee Verstappen the edge. Yes, straight line speed is a powerful tool, especially on a track with long DRS zones like Yas Marina. But you don't spend much time driving in a straight line. The corners decide the lap time, and right now the McLaren looks like the more comfortable car in those moments where the driver needs confidence and downforce. However, Red Bull's choice isn't necessarily a mistake. It might even be intentional. By running less downforce on Friday, Verstappen can explore the limits in a safer, more predictable way. If the team chooses to add a touch more wing on Saturday, the baseline data becomes more valuable. And if Verstappen really is hiding some qualifying, pace, which we'll get into later, then the mismatch between straight line speed and cornering performance might be part of the act. Teams often disguise their true setup window on Fridays, especially before a title decider. The real picture only settles once the fuel loads drop and the tyre prep becomes serious. Now, let's shift from the long runs to the part everyone talks about after practice, the single lap pace. The problem with looking at the FP2 leaderboard is that it often shows the least useful part of the story. One quick lap per driver, usually on different tyres with different fuel loads and often different track conditions, can make a midfield car look like a contender and hide the real strengths of the frontrunners. That's exactly what happened here. On paper, McLaren topped the times. In reality, the picture is much more layered. Start with top speed. Red Bull's fastest lap shows a clear advantage, around 3 to 4 kilometers per hour above the session's average. McLaren sits a little below that middle line, and Mercedes is right there with them. Even Alpine, which has been rumoured to be slightly down on power, managed to place itself in the same region. But the raw numbers need context. For example, Alpine's fastest lap was done on soft tyres that already had 5 laps on them. Alonso's time, which placed him safely inside the top 10, came on 6-lap-old softs. Meanwhile, Norris and Verstappen both used a brand new set. So, the gaps on the timesheets don't reflect equal conditions. And because qualifying is all about maximising the tyre on its peak lap, Alonso's performance suggests he may be more of a threat on Saturday than his ranking implies. Once you lay all the fastest laps over a track map, the style of each car becomes obvious. The Red Bull paints the straights in blue. Every major acceleration zone, every long stretch, Verstappen has the advantage. But the McLaren lights up the corners, especially the medium and high-speed ones, where balance and grip matter more than pure horsepower. Even though the list of orange zones, McLaren favouring areas, is shorter, they occur in the places where drivers spend the most time. 10 metres gained in a straight can be erased in a moment, but 10 metres gained in a corner, where the car must hold speed and maintain stability, counts for far more. This is why McLaren's mean speed looks lower, yet their lap time is faster. They aren't slow, they're simply geared toward efficiency, where the lap is won. But the theme that keeps coming back is how different the two cars are approaching this weekend. McLaren is leaning heavily into downforce, trying to make the car unbeatable in the twisty final sector. Red Bull is leaning into top speed, hoping straight-line power compensates for corner entry compromises. And then there's the strategic wrinkle. Sometimes what you see on Friday isn't the real setup. Teams often hide their qualifying trim until FP3. If Verstappen is indeed holding something back, and later telemetry hints this might be true, then Red Bull's Friday performance could be more of a placeholder than a real indication of their ceiling. McLaren looks strong, but the gap may not be as large as the timesheets say. To understand the real fight for pole, you have to break the lap into pieces. Looking at full lap times only tells you who was fast. It doesn't tell you why they were fast. When you compare the sector times from each driver's quickest lap, suddenly the puzzle starts fitting together and the strengths and weaknesses of each car become impossible to ignore. Sector 1 in Abu Dhabi is a mix of direction changes and higher speed entries. It's not full of long corners, but it demands trust in the front end of the car. Norris is the standout here. He takes about 1.5 tenths out of Verstappen before they even reach the first DRS zone. That kind of gap isn't massive, but it sets the tone for the rest of the lap. Whenever the car needs to lean on downforce, the McLaren just looks more comfortable. Verstappen tries to claw some of that back in the next straight, and he does gain time, thanks mostly to the top speed advantage Red Bull built into their setup. But even that recovery doesn't erase the entire deficit, and it becomes obvious that Red Bull is depending heavily on straight-line strength to keep the lap competitive. Sector 2 is where that straight-line strategy pays off. It's mostly long acceleration zones and flat-out sections. Verstappen gains close to 1 tenth back on Norris, and he pulls a much bigger chunk on Piastri. In areas where the car needs low drag rather than corner grip, the Red Bull comes alive. If the entire lap looked like Sector 2, Verstappen would be leading the timing sheets by a wide margin. But that's the challenge of Yas Marina. It doesn't reward one type of setup. It rewards whoever can handle the full package. And that brings us to Sector 3, the place where Verstappen is losing the most time and the place that will likely decide the outcome of qualifying. This final part of the lap is slow, twisty, and punishing. The tyres are hot, the downforce needs to work, and the car must stay planted through long sequences where the driver can't afford hesitation. Norris is excellent here, and the McLaren is doing exactly what a high downforce setup is supposed to do. Stay stable while carrying speed through corners that degrade the tyres and punish understeer. Verstappen, on the other hand, loses almost 3/10 in this single sector alone. That is enormous at this level. Even if he wins the straight line war in Sector 2, he gives it back, and more, in the final part of the lap. When you plot losses across all drivers, Verstappen's Sector 3 deficit sticks out like a red warning light. It's almost identical in size to the combined loss George Russell suffers in Sectors 2 and 3. That comparison tells you everything. Mercedes is simply lacking overall grip. Red Bull, meanwhile, is losing the majority of its time in one very specific location. And if they can't recover that in qualifying, Norris becomes the favourite for pole, not because of one fast lap, but because his car is delivering where the lap time truly matters. Once you look at the sector times, the next step is digging into the telemetry. This is where the real surprises show up, because the fastest laps from Norris and Verstappen tell a story that isn't obvious at first glance. The graphs may look technical, but the patterns are simple. Anytime the track straightens, Verstappen's speed trace rises above Norris. Anytime the lap bends or requires confidence on turn-in, the McLaren's trace pulls ahead. But buried inside these shapes are little details that raise an eyebrow, details that make you wonder if Verstappen was showing everything he had. The first hint comes at turn 5. Up to the braking zone, Verstappen is doing exactly what you expect, carrying more speed from the lower downforce setup. But then, suddenly his speed trace drops in a way that doesn't match a normal braking pattern. Instead of a clean off throttle, then brake, there's a brief lift with no immediate braking input. When you zoom in on the throttle pedal, it becomes even clearer. Verstappen lifts early, coasts, and only then hits the brakes. This is the kind of trace you see from a team doing energy saving or tyre preservation runs, something Ferrari often shows when testing lift and coast strategies. Seeing it on Verstappen's fastest lap is strange, to say the least. Does it mean he lost a huge amount of time? And no, but it does mean his lap wasn't fully optimized. And when a driver lifts early on what is supposed to be a qualifying simulation, you have to wonder why. Was he avoiding a snap of oversteer? Was he managing brake temperatures? Or was he simply not trying to max out that corner so Red Bull could keep their true potential hidden? Any of those explanations is possible, and all of them affect the reading of the lap time. You see a similar pattern at the end of the lap. Both drivers lift slightly too early before crossing the line, but Verstappen lifts even earlier than Norris. Again, the time loss isn't huge, but it reinforces the feeling that the Red Bull wasn't being pushed to its full limit. And that matters, because Verstappen isn't losing 3.5 tenths from these small areas. He's losing that time in the fast corners and in the long final sector. That deficit looks real. The small throttle lifts don't change the big picture, but they do hint that Verstappen might have more in reserve, especially for qualifying. Look at the corner entry speeds and braking performance, and the contrast becomes even sharper. In turn 1, the McLaren carries around 10 km/h more minimum speed. That is a massive downforce advantage. Because of that extra grip, Norris can also brake later and harder in several big braking zones. Turns 1, 9 and 16, Norris commits deeper and holds the speed longer. Verstappen's braking traces show earlier inputs and slightly softer pressure peaks. It's not a lack of skill, it's the car balance. A low downforce setup simply won't give the same stability under braking. So, yes, Verstappen definitely has time left on the table, but how much of it comes from sandbagging, and how much comes from the car's natural limitations? That's the real question, and one only qualifying can answer. Up to this point, most of the focus has been on Verstappen versus Norris, but the other major storyline from FP2 is what's happening inside McLaren. For several weekends now, Piastri has looked like he's been inching closer to Norris in qualifying, but the data from Abu Dhabi tells a very different story. When you overlay their fastest laps, the gap between them becomes impossible to ignore. Even though they're in the same car, on the same tyre, with the same track conditions, their laps look like they were set in completely different machines. The first major difference appears in the braking zones. At almost every heavy braking point, turn 1, turn 9, turn 16, Norris brakes later and carries more speed into the corner. This isn't just a matter of being braver. Norris has the car more settled on entry. His traces show strong, confident braking with sharp, clean lines. Piastri's traces, by comparison, slope earlier and softer. He's hitting the brake pedal sooner and rolling into the pressure instead of committing instantly. That alone costs him time, but the effect snowballs. When you brake earlier, you enter the corner slower. When you enter slower, your minimum speed falls. And when your minimum speed falls, the exit becomes weaker, even if the throttle application looks fine. And that is exactly what the telemetry shows. Piastri's exits aren't bad. In fact, on several straights, he hits a slightly higher top speed than Norris. That means he's not losing time under acceleration or traction. His losses are happening before the car even reaches the apex. Corner entry and mid-corner speed are the areas that separate them, and together those account for several tenths of a second. Over one lap, that's the difference earned between P1 and the edge of the top 6. McLaren's summary data makes the picture even clearer. Norris shows a higher peak deceleration average, meaning he's stopping the car more effectively. In low-speed corners, where mechanical grip matters most, Norris carries around 2.5 kilometers per hour more speed. In high-speed corners, the gap is closer to 2 kilometers per hour. Those numbers sound small, but between two teammates, they are huge. That is the kind of gap you see when one driver feels completely connected to the car, while the other is still searching for the limit on corner entry. The problem for Piastri is timing. Abu Dhabi is not a forgiving track for drivers struggling with early corner rotation. Sector 1 and Sector 3 are full of places where confidence and precision matter more than raw talent. One small hesitation can ruin an entire lap, and that's what the data shows. Piastri isn't missing massive chunks of time in one place. He's losing small pieces everywhere the corner demands early commitment. Add them together, and the gap becomes a wall that's hard to climb in a single weekend. If Piastri wants to be part of the front row fight, he needs to unlock that entry speed. Otherwise, the battle up front stays between Norris and Verstappen, and Oscar is left hoping changes in setup can bring him closer. When you step back and look at everything together, the long runs, the fastest laps, the sector data, and the deeper telemetry traces, the picture of this title-deciding weekend becomes far more complex than any headline suggests. McLaren looks strong, yes. Norris looks sharp, yes. But nothing in the data says Verstappen is out of the fight. In fact, several details suggest the gap between them isn't nearly as wide as the timing sheets show. Verstappen's top speed advantage is real. His early stint pace is real. And the odd lift and coast moments hint that Red Bull might not have shown their true hand yet. The only real weakness on the Red Bull is the final sector, where the car simply doesn't rotate or grip the way the McLaren does. That sector alone could decide pole position, but qualifying doesn't always follow the clean logic of practice. A small shift in wind direction, a tiny temperature change, or even a fresh track after under-series running can swing the advantage from one car to another. If Red Bull adds even a little more downforce on Saturday, Verstappen's confidence in the high-speed corners could rise dramatically. And if Verstappen cleans up the braking zones where he lifted early, the gap could shrink very quickly. The lap time he loses in Sector 3 is big, yes, but it's not impossible to recover if the setup window moves in his favour. The bigger question is whether Red Bull wants to chase that downforce, or whether they believe straight-line strength is their best weapon for both qualifying and the race. For McLaren, the situation is almost the opposite. Norris already looks comfortable. The car is doing exactly what he needs it to do. Stable on entry, strong in the fast corners, and predictable on the brakes. If McLaren finds any improvement, it will likely come from small balance changes or tyre preparation adjustments, not major setup shifts. The risk for them is that their entire advantage depends on the corners. If track conditions change or grip levels drop, the margin Norris enjoys today could disappear quickly. And because McLaren is running more downforce, they don't have much to gain on the straights. Their pace must come from execution, not pure power. Piastri, meanwhile, sits in a tricky middle ground. His pace gaps are small but persistent, and on a one-lap qualifying run, small weaknesses become major problems. If he doesn't gain confidence into the braking zones and early corner phases, he may find himself a step behind the front row fight. He isn't struggling on traction or top speed, that part is working. But unless he closes the entry speed gap to Norris, he could end up playing a supporting role in McLaren's biggest weekend of the year. As for other teams, the only realistic wildcard is Mercedes. Their pace isn't close enough to threaten a win, but they could easily slot themselves between the McLarens and Verstappen if one of the frontrunners makes a mistake. Alonso's pace on old tyres suggests he could join the edge of the Q3 fight, but not the very front. So after all the charts, traces and comparisons, the simplest summary is this. McLaren holds the advantage right now, but Verstappen is still close enough to turn everything upside down. The fight for pole will likely come down to whether Red Bull solves that final sector, and whether Norris can maintain the razor-sharp precision he showed in practice. Nothing is settled, nothing is guaranteed. But one thing is certain, the first clues from Friday have only made this title decider even more intense.